The old room seemed to hold its breath when I stepped inside again. Faded air, still surfaces, dust floating like quiet fragments of memory. It felt as if the walls remembered more than any record ever did. Nothing moved, yet everything carried a faint echo of steps taken long ago. Time here had the strange habit of pausing, like a clock that decided to stop at the exact moment the past turned into something that no one wanted to revisit. And as I crossed the threshold, the room showed itself the way it had in the first visit years earlier. Dim corners, a forgotten table, a single chair with its shadow stretched thin across the floor. The silence felt almost aware, as though it waited for something to be acknowledged. I moved slowly, letting each detail rise on its own. The scent of old wood, the dry trace of paper, the faint chill that stayed even though the day outside was warm. I had walked into many such places in my career, but this one held a particular weight, quiet yet firm. It had been the starting point of a puzzle left without completion. A case filed, revisited, then left untouched for years until new information forced us to return. It felt strangely like coming back to a message we once ignored. Her name had been Amara Ellington, 24 at the time. A soft-spoken student with a calm presence, known for her artwork and her habit of writing short notes to herself on scraps of paper. A life that had seemed steady though quiet. Her background had always been described by those around her as gentle, even reserved, as if she moved through the world with careful steps, never rushing, never letting emotion spill too freely. She lived alone, worked part-time at a small bookstore, and spent evenings sketching scenes from imagination. Nothing about her life had suggested that she would vanish from the map of ordinary days the way she did. My first visit to this room had been in the last months of 1993. I had been new to the department, still learning how to read places, how to listen to the silence between objects. Even then, something about this space had made me uneasy, not from fear, but from the sense of something unfinished. We had searched every inch, filled reports, gathered files, collected statements. Each step felt correct, methodical, proper, yet no clear line of logic had formed. The trail had gone faint too soon. Now, decades later, the reopened case brought me back into the same dimness. Documents had surfaced. A detail in an unrelated record had pointed back here. A name repeated in two separate files. A lapse in a statement that once slipped past us because we trusted a face we thought was reliable. It was small, almost unnoticeable. But precision has a way of turning small pieces into entire maps. I stood by the table where the first file had been placed all those years ago. The folder now held fresh notes, new tags clipped beside the old yellowed ones. My hand hovered over the cover for a moment. The paper felt heavier than its actual weight. When I opened it, the faint sound of shifting sheets filled the room, almost too loud in the stillness. The first page greeted me with her picture, a calm expression, steady eyes, a slight tilt of the head as if listening. I remembered that face from every briefing, every conversation, every night when the case crossed my mind without warning. The details of her life were written with careful strokes. Her age, her routine, her studies at the local community college, her circle of friends, all small and simple elements that didn't hint at conflict or complication. I placed the photograph gently back in the folder. The second page was the original timeline we had reconstructed the year she disappeared. Precise, hour by hour, anchored by the statements of those who had interacted with her last. A friend who saw her leaving class. A neighbor who spotted her unlocking her door around dusk. A store receipt from a small corner market, timestamp faintly smudged. Nothing unusual, nothing chaotic. Just the quiet rhythm of a day like any other. But the third page, the one that had prompted the reopening, held the detail that changed everything. A simple note in the margin of a 1993 witness statement. The handwriting belonged to someone who had later retired. The ink was barely visible now. It read, He hesitated. That was it, 2 words. A moment of pause that no one in the team had questioned further back then. We read the statement, asked questions, filed the information, moved on to more urgent leads. The hesitation had been dismissed as common uncertainty. Most people in cases like this speak with some level of caution. It wasn't unusual, but logic, once applied with the right perspective, has a way of making even a small pause into something significant. The witness in question had been a coworker of Amara's at the bookstore, a man named Cal Reeves. At the time, he had come across as polite, soft-spoken, somewhat nervous but cooperative. He mentioned seeing her the day she went missing. He provided the usual observations. She seemed quiet, she seemed focused, she seemed like herself. His statement had been neatly aligned with what others said. But the margin note remained. Someone on the team had seen something in his tone, something unsteady. I closed the folder and exhaled softly. The air felt heavier, as though the room didn't want the thought to settle. On the far side of the space, an old metal cabinet waited in the grayness. I approached it, the floor creaking lightly under my steps. The cabinet door resisted when I pulled it open, as if stuck between the years. Inside were the original evidence boxes, small cardboard containers marked with dates. The edges were worn. A thin film of dust lay over them. I pulled out the box labeled with her name and set it on the table. When the cardboard gave beneath my fingers, I lifted the lid slowly. Inside were the objects recovered from her small apartment, items untouched since the case had gone cold. A sketchbook rested on top, its cover textured and slightly worn. I opened it, careful not to disturb the fragile edges. The pages held simple drawings, quiet scenes, soft lines, imagined landscapes with long horizons and calm water. Nothing unusual, nothing coded or hidden. Just the mind of someone who found comfort in creating. Underneath the sketchbook was a small stack of folded notes, her habit of writing brief reminders or thoughts on scrap paper. I unfolded the first one. It read, "Remember to breathe before rushing." A simple line, a personal mantra perhaps. Another note said, "Silence is not absence, it's space." The words felt almost prophetic in this room where silence held every memory. I set the notes aside and reached for the item at the bottom of the box, a photograph, a candid shot. Amara standing outside the bookstore with a few coworkers, including Reeves. Her expression was calm, her posture relaxed, but something about the image made me pause. The angles, the distance between them. The way his hand rested on his side, fingers slightly clenched. Not tense, yet not entirely at ease either. I wasn't looking for guilt in the photograph. Emotion can be misleading, but details, when paired with logic, often reveal patterns the heart overlooks. The air in the room shifted slightly as a breeze moved through the cracked window. A faint rustle followed, paper on paper. It reminded me of the sound the first time we searched this room, the way each sheet had spoken with faint friction, each detail waiting for someone patient enough to notice. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the new file, the one that had triggered everything. Cross-department information. A report from a nearby county about an unrelated case, recorded years after the original timeline. Inside that report was a reference to a familiar name, Reeves. Nothing shocking. He had later moved towns, changed jobs, kept a low profile. The file wasn't alarming. It was routine. But one line in that record aligned with the margin note from 1993. In the newer case, he had been interviewed as a bystander. Again, someone noted, he hesitated. Different town, different context, different people, and yet the same pause, the same distant uncertainty. This wasn't proof, but it was enough to revisit the past with clearer eyes. I looked back around the room. The dull outlines, the faint light from outside, the shadows that never fully shifted, Everything seemed to carry the weight of what we didn't see the first time. The room didn't accuse. It didn't reveal. It simply held its posture, waiting for someone to read its quiet message. I placed the sketchbook back in the box, along with the notes and photograph. As I lowered the lid, the pieces inside settled softly, as though relieved to be acknowledged. When I straightened, I felt the familiar pull of responsibility, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady and constant, the way old cases press on the mind long after the files close. Something had always felt incomplete about this one. And now, the puzzle had begun forming lines that made sense. I closed the cabinet gently and turned toward the window. Outside, the day had begun to dim. Long shadows stretched across the yard, matching the lines inside the room. The truth wasn't here yet, but its outline had begun to appear. And outlines once seen do not easily fade. The evening settled outside the old building as I stepped back into the main hallway. Light from the windows stretched in long shapes across the floor, faint and pale, touching the edges of each doorframe. The silence here felt like an extension of the room I had just left, steady, patient, and unwilling to rush toward any conclusion. Cases this old did not respond to speed. They opened slowly, the way paper absorbs light bit by bit, revealing layers that had always been there, waiting. I carried the folders with me, their weight balanced against my arm. The hallway air had the faint scent of varnish and dust baked into the walls over time. A distant hum, old wiring maybe, added a soft vibration to the quiet. At the end of the corridor was the small office we had repurposed for cold case reviews. The lamp on the desk cast a warm circle over the surface, leaving the corners of the room dim. I closed the door behind me, set the folders down, and took a seat. The chair creaked faintly as if remembering previous investigators who had occupied it before retiring, transferring, or moving on. I opened the main file again, noting the familiar arrangement: photographs, timelines, witness statements, handwritten corrections. The ink had faded slightly, but the shapes of the letters remained clear. Under the lamp, the pages seemed to glow in a muted amber tone, like an old film reel projected against a wall. Reeves's statement from 1993 lay near the top. I read it once more, slowly, letting each detail settle. His tone on the page was steady. His answers were short, consistent, predictable. He had seen Amara near closing time. She appeared calm. She mentioned she had errands. She left shortly after. That was all. I remembered the interview session from years ago, though only fragments remained in my mind. His eyes shifting occasionally. His hands clasped together. A faint tremor in his breath, nothing alarming, nothing that stood out above the usual uncertainty of being questioned. But the margin note, that small observation, had been overlooked because it felt too subtle. And subtlety often gets lost when the team focuses on larger leads. I placed the statement aside and reached for the more recent file from the neighboring county. It wasn't related to Amara's case, at least not directly. It concerned a minor property incident in a small commercial district. Reeves had been nearby and offered generic information. His presence wasn't suspicious. Yet someone had written the same comment. He hesitated. 2 different officers, 2 different years, 2 different contexts, and yet the same detail. Perhaps hesitation meant nothing. Perhaps it was just a personality trait. Some people naturally pause before speaking, but repetition across unrelated settings can become a pattern worth studying. Especially now, after all these years, when the smallest thread might be the one we need. I leaned back slightly, listening to the faint echo of my breath in the room. The building had an old, steady heartbeat, creaks, hums, shifting walls adapting to the cooling air outside. It felt almost alive in its patience. On the far side of the desk lay a stack of old cassette recordings. Conversations from 1993 had been archived on these tapes before digital files became standard. The labels had faded, but one still held a readable name: Store Interviews Day 4. I reached for it, set it into the small player we kept for archival reviews, and pressed the worn play button. A brief static swell filled the air, followed by faint voices. The sound quality was thin but clear enough to follow. A younger version of my own voice spoke first, steady, formal, controlled. I heard questions I barely remembered phrasing. Simple, direct, typical for early case interviews. Then Reeves answered. His tone matched what was written in the statement, mild, soft, polite. But through the thin static I heard something else, an inflection I hadn't noticed at the time. A slight pause before responding to certain questions. Not every question, only those that involved timing or proximity. Seconds stretched just a little too long before his words arrived. Subtle, yes, but unmistakable when you knew to listen for it. I listened twice, then again. Each repetition made the pause more distinctive. Not fear, not pressure. Something more controlled, like someone choosing their words deliberately. When the tape clicked off, the silence returned with a deeper presence, as though the room itself had heard the difference. I removed the cassette and set it aside. My mind traced the timeline again, her leaving class, her returning home, her stop at the market, her brief conversation at the store where she worked. All ordinary steps, and then the hours after when silence replaced movement. I picked up the small notebook assigned for the new review and wrote down the key threads. Margin note, he hesitated. Repeat in later unrelated file. Pattern consistent in recording. Explore schedule, location overlaps. The last point mattered most. If logic were to guide us, and it had to, then we needed to map Reeves's movements precisely. Facts always draw their own lines when placed together. I opened the original diagram from 1993. The map showed Amara's neighborhood, the bookstore, and the small market. I marked each location again, cross-checking distances with known walking times. Then I added a new set of approximations based on Reeves's known routine back then, his shift schedule, his commute, his common routes. Even without sensitive terms, the puzzle took shape. A knock sounded at the door, soft, tentative. I looked up. Detective Lane stepped in. He was new to the unit, sharp in detail, calm in approach. His voice always carried a level tone, neither rushed nor heavy. "You asked for the archive logs," he said quietly, placing a folder on the corner of the desk. I nodded, "Thanks." He glanced at the cassette machine and then at the files spread out. "You're seeing something." "Possibly," I said, "small but steady." Lane stepped closer, careful not to disturb anything on the table. "Same name in the newer file." "Yes." "And the pattern." "Consistent." He didn't speak for a moment. The room held the silence like a page waiting for ink. Then he asked, "Want me to do a location trace?" "Not yet," I replied. "We're dealing with decades. We need accuracy, not speed." Lane nodded, understanding. He knew the nature of cold cases. The line between discovery and assumption was narrow, and patience was often more valuable than momentum. "I'll run a background comparison," he said. "See if his routines changed much over the years." "Good." As he turned to leave, I added, "Check for small links, indirect paths, anything that aligns over time." He gave a slight nod and stepped out, closing the door quietly behind him. I returned to the files. The archive logs Lane delivered held the old staff schedules from the bookstore, attendance sheets, shift swaps, notes scribbled by the manager. I scanned them slowly. On the day Amara disappeared, Reeves's shift ended 20 minutes before hers. Not unusual, but the log showed he stayed after clocking out, something noted by the manager only because he had rearranged a small display at the entrance before leaving. I underlined that detail. Staying late wasn't strange. Employees often lingered, but context mattered. That meant he had been present longer than his statement suggested. I flipped through additional logs looking for consistency. 3 times in the month before her disappearance, he stayed behind after his shift. Twice in the month after, before the case turned cold. Each time, no clear reason was written. Patterns rarely speak loudly. They whisper, but the whisper becomes louder when placed beside a timeline that demands inspection. I set the logs aside and opened a different folder, Amara's personal file. Inside were notes from friends and acquaintances describing her personality, her habits, her patterns. She avoided conflict. She rarely changed her routine. She trusted people quietly but cautiously. She kept distance but not out of fear, more out of introspection. One line from a friend's statement stood out. Amara didn't talk much, but she noticed everything. I read the sentence twice. It aligned with the tone of her sketches, her notes, her quiet presence. She saw more than she expressed. I reached for the photography envelope from earlier, the one containing the candid group shot outside the bookstore. I studied it again under the lamp. The posture, the spacing, the subtle body language. Then I noticed something small, something I had missed the first time. Amara stood slightly angled away from Reeves, not directly but enough to suggest a comfortable yet cautious distance. Not avoidance, just a gentle awareness. Body cues can be complex, but they sometimes reveal comfort levels far better than words. More importantly, her gaze in the photo wasn't directed at the camera. She was looking slightly to the side, toward a point outside the frame, a detail easy to overlook. What had been there? A sound, a person, a moment. The answer wouldn't be in the photo, but the angle of her eyes implied a thought, a reaction, something that moved her attention away from the photographer. I flipped the photo to the back. A faint pencil marking read, "Late Summer '93 storefront." Nothing more. The building felt colder as I leaned back in the chair. Outside, night had settled fully. The window reflected the interior of the office, the table, the lamp, the open folders, like a mirror holding 2 timelines at once. The logic began forming a sequence. A margin note from decades ago. A second record years later. A repeated hesitation. A pattern of staying late. A photograph with subtle cues. A timeline that allowed overlap. Not a conclusion, not even a strong lead yet, but a line had begun to draw itself across the years. I closed the files carefully and rested my hands on the table. The case wasn't moving fast, but it was moving. A slow shift. A quiet rearrangement of pieces. Cold cases demand that kind of stillness before clarity arrives. Outside the window, a streetlight flickered, casting brief patterns of light onto the office wall. Each flicker felt like a heartbeat, marking another moment closer to understanding what had gone unnoticed for so long. Something small was waiting. Something steady. Something logical. Something that had been in the margins all along. And now, finally, the silence around it had started to thin. The next morning arrived with a pale, muted light that drifted slowly through the office windows. I had slept poorly, the case sitting in the back of my mind like a quiet pulse. Most cold cases fade during rest, dissolving for a few hours before returning, but this one had held on, steady and persistent. When I reached the office, Lane was already inside. He stood near the board where our timelines had been pinned, reviewing the notes with a faint crease between his brows. I ran a comparison, he said without turning. Routines, addresses, commutes, there's something. I set my coat on the chair and approached. What did you find? He tapped a location marked on the map. Here, a small road that ran behind the market. Back in '93 it wasn't paved, just a gravel lane that connected two older streets. I remembered it faintly, a quiet shortcut often overlooked because it wasn't on the main grid. Lane continued, found an old zoning record. For 2 years, Reeves lived a block from this lane. His route home could have taken him through here. That's within the window, I said. He nodded, exactly. I studied the map more closely. The road sat between Amara's last known locations. Her path and his path could have crossed without intention, without planning, without any visible trace left behind. A coincidence, Lane asked softly. I shook my head, two aligned. He placed a thin folder into my hand. There's more. Inside were records pulled from the town library archive, community newsletters, old staff announcements, seasonal notices from the bookstore. Tucked among them was a small note from 1993. Staff reminder, front display rearranged by CR before closing. The initials matched Reeves. The date matched the day Amara last interacted with him. Another subtle thread, another quiet pattern. I slid the folder onto the desk. Has he been contacted yet? I asked. Lane shook his head. Not until we sort this. Good, I said. We need precision. Cold cases broke easily if rushed. Too many years, too many changed memories. Only logic could keep the pace correct. I picked up the cassette again. The soft static greeted me like an old echo. I played it once more, focusing on the tone rather than the words. The same measured pause, not fear, not confusion, something more deliberate, as though each answer had to pass through a filter before leaving his mouth. Lane stood beside me, listening. That pause, he whispered, it's not random. No, I said, it's consistent. We let the recording finish, then sat in silence. The room felt still, almost suspended. I reached for the photograph again, the group shot. Under the morning light, the details shifted slightly. The small shadows behind each person became sharper. The angles felt clearer. And again, I noticed her gaze drifting just outside the frame, as though something had caught her attention in that moment. I set the photo down carefully. What if it wasn't a moment? I said quietly. What if it was a pattern she noticed, the way she noticed everything else? Lane raised a brow. You think she sensed something? She was observant, I said. She paid attention. But she didn't say anything. Not in words, I murmured, but maybe in her behavior, in her routine, in how she spaced herself. Lane folded his arms. Then the question becomes what she noticed. I didn't answer immediately. The room held the quiet like an open page. The air felt still, as though waiting. Finally, I said, we should look for overlaps in their schedules beyond work. We began tracing lines across the timeline again, slow, careful, methodical. Lane retrieved attendance sheets from the college she attended. I compared them with the store schedules. Inch by inch, the patterns formed. 3 matches. 3 days where both had adjusted their routine slightly. Small shift, nothing obvious. But small shifts build maps. On one of those days, the market receipt placed Amara at the store shortly after Reeves's shift. He had stayed later than scheduled. She had arrived during that window. Their paths had crossed with natural ease. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. But when viewed across decades, The ordinary can become the key. By noon, a shape had formed, a logical outline, not complete, not sharp, but undeniable in its direction. "We should talk to him," Lane said quietly. I nodded. "Today." We retrieved the contact information from the updated records. Reeves lived in a small town 2 hours away. A quiet neighborhood, narrow streets lined with porches and trimmed hedges. The drive there was quiet. The sky held a faint overcast haze, the kind that softens light into a muted gray. Lane drove while I reviewed the file once more. Each page felt like it carried the weight of the years in its paper grain. "He's older now," Lane said. "People change." "Patterns don't," I replied. When we reached his street, the afternoon had dimmed slightly. A row of modest homes stood in a curved line, each washed in the soft November light. He answered the door with a gentle posture, his voice quiet. His hair had thinned. His expression was mild, polite. Age had softened the edges of his features, but his eyes held the same clarity from the photograph. We kept the conversation calm, polite, steady. No tension, no pressure, just questions placed with care. Lane asked about the bookstore first. Memories surfaced slowly. Names, faces, routines. His tone remained even, steady. But then came a question about Amara, gentle, soft, respectful. And there it was again. The pause, small but present. A controlled inhale before the words emerged. "She was thoughtful," he said, quiet. Another slight pause before he continued. His gaze dropped briefly to the floor. Lane and I exchanged a glance, so subtle it barely existed. I asked about the day she left. His answer was the same as the statement from decades earlier, but something in the rhythm shifted. Not the content, just the tempo, as though he was following a script he had practiced for years. I didn't push. I simply let the silence sit between us. Silence has a way of pressing gently, encouraging truth to surface without force. "We're reviewing old files," I said, "looking for clarity. Sometimes small details help more than big ones." He nodded slowly. "I understand." Another pause before his next breath. Not fear, not pressure. Calculation. We thanked him and stepped away. No accusations, no speculation, just an ending to a calm conversation. But as we walked toward the car, Lane whispered, "He's carrying something." "Yes," I said, "and he's carried it for a long time." The drive back felt heavier, not with emotion, but with logic assembling itself into quiet conclusions. Back at the office, dusk had settled. The building felt older in the low light, its hallways stretching into calm shadows. We returned to the board. Every piece of evidence waited in its place: photographs, schedules, statements, notes. I stood before it, letting the entire timeline speak at once. Lane broke the silence. "It's the hesitations, they're the thread." "Not just that," I said softly. "It's the way they repeat. He repeats the same version of events each time, not altered, just preserved." Lane frowned, like someone rehearsing a memory. "Or protecting one," I said. I approached the board and tapped the timeline intersection where their routines overlapped. "This is it. Not a dramatic moment, just a quiet one." Lane watched me, waiting. "Look at the pattern," I continued. Every time his schedule changed slightly, hers shifted in a mirrored way, but she didn't realize it. She noticed something, but didn't name it. Her sketches, her notes, her gaze in the photograph. She sensed something near her space. "Not danger," Lane said quietly, "just presence." "Yes," I replied, a presence she didn't know how to interpret. Lane stepped closer. "So the twist is consistency." I nodded. Consistency across decades. The same hesitations, the same phrasing, the same rhythm in his answers. It's not coincidence. It's a pattern of maintaining a timeline unchanged. Lane exhaled softly. Most people's recollections evolve. Unless they guard them, I said. We didn't discuss what that meant out loud. We didn't need to. The evidence pointed toward something subtle, something logical, a truth that didn't require dramatic revelation to be understood. It was there, steady, patient in the margins. The final piece came when I opened Amara's sketchbook again. Beneath one of the landscape pages, faint pencil marks almost invisible unless tilted toward the light revealed two letters, CR, drawn lightly in the corner. Not a message, not a warning, just a moment she had captured. Perhaps she saw him in a reflection. Perhaps he passed by quietly, something small enough that she recorded it without knowing why. The weight of the years pressed gently against the room as I closed the book. Lane spoke quietly, "So what now?" "We follow the logic," I said. "We present the pattern, let the process move forward." He nodded. "It doesn't feel final." "It's not meant to," I replied. Cold cases rarely close cleanly. They end with lines drawn by effort, not certainty, with reflections, not conclusions. As the night settled around the office, I looked again at her photograph. Her calm expression, her steady eyes, the tilt of her head. A life quiet enough to be overlooked, yet detailed enough to hold the truth in its margins. Justice would move forward in its mechanical way, through forms, hearings, procedures. But none of that touched the lingering quiet in the room. The truth had surfaced not through force but through patience, through subtle patterns, through the faint sound of a recorded pause. And as I turned off the lamp, leaving the room in low light, a small thought stayed with me. Sometimes the past isn't hidden. Sometimes it waits in silence, steady as dust on old paper, until someone finally listens. And even then, clarity does not erase the quiet weight it leaves behind.